Well, thank you so much. This is actually really inspiring. Just hearing the previous speakers and presentations, I'm really loving this. I live in Queens. I live in Forest Hills. My mom grew up in Flushing. My parents, when they had stopped dating, ran into each other 2 or 3 times on the 7 train surreptitiously, and they knew at that point that they were meant to be together. So, sort of something about Queens that I think has brought me here today. As was mentioned, I run the Center for an Urban Future. We're a think tank here in New York. We're kind of a unique think tank in that we actually focus on New York City. We're not national in scope. We publish reports about things like the powerful impact that immigrant entrepreneurs are having in New York City's economy. We just did a study earlier this year about the really increasingly important role of branch libraries in New York, and Queens has an exceptional one, but libraries have become more important. We've written about how community colleges have become real platforms for economic mobility in today's economy, and we've done reports about outer borough transit gaps. But one of the things that's really, I think, made me proud about our organization that we're very 5-borough focused. And I think that as we've scanned the economic development horizon in New York over the last 10, 15 years, it's really been evident. I think everybody following New York has seen what a rise Brooklyn has been on in recent years. And I think that to some extent, Queens has just been in the shadow of Brooklyn. I think that Queens has been in the shadow of Manhattan for a lot longer time. And I think that it really occurred to us, though, that there's so much to build on in this borough. There's actually a lot that's starting to happen. And I think you've probably glimpsed in some of the slides and just by going around Queens, I think there's an interesting moment right now in time for Queens. And we thought it was a great opportunity, especially at a time of transition in the city. We're going to have a new mayor. We're going to have a new borough president. And maybe the next decade, maybe the next 20 years can be kind of the time of Queens's rise. And if so, what needs to be done to really plan for that, to prepare that? Because not only did we want to do this study about Queens's future, because Queens was in the shadow of other places in New York, but we also felt like that there needs to be more strategic planning for Queens. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this work that we're doing right now. We're tentatively calling it Queens 2030. It's still a work in progress, so I can't tell you that all of our ideas are finalized. We don't have all the answers yet. The way we go about our research is we do lots and lots of data analysis, which we're still doing, but we also interview dozens and dozens of people. And so we've been doing that and really talking to people in all walks of life from Queens. And, at the end of my presentation, if anybody here has specific ideas that we should consider for Queens's future, I'd certainly love to hear them. So as we are working on this, let me just get this to the start. I apologize. So when we do work on economic development and looking at kind of future opportunities, I think the best place to start is, what are the assets? What can Queens build on? And clearly this is a borough with so many assets to build on, and I'm just going to talk to a few of them that we've identified so far. Quality of life. I think when you think about all the different boroughs, Queens is definitely one that quality of life, really strong, great neighborhoods is at the heart of Queens' DNA. Safety. New York has the second safest borough behind Staten Island. People move here because they have safe communities. Great public schools. This even surprised me, but Queens has the highest percentage of public schools in New York City that got an A grade on the most recent test, and it wasn't even close. 2 of the top 50 schools in U.S. News and World Report's national ranking of high schools are in Queens. And by the way, both of these high schools, which I list here, are actually more highly ranked than Stuyvesant. What do we also hear about Queens? it's an aspirational borough. I think it's New York City's most aspirational borough. This is hard to define. It's hard to point to data to describe this, but in so many of the interviews we've done for this project, we've heard time and again that this is a place that people move to, not just immigrants, but certainly including immigrants, to really work hard and get ahead, or work hard and give your children the opportunity to get ahead. And I think that part of that, being an aspirational place, is the affordability. And so much more than Manhattan, certainly now much more than Brooklyn, Queens is a place that still has some affordability. Just a couple of statistics here. The current difference in price per square foot in condos, it's 44% cheaper in New York City than in Brooklyn right now. And median sales prices of co-op apartments are almost 75% less in Queens than in Brooklyn. Diversity. Andrew Beveridge is one of my favorite professors in all of New York. I love to see what he's doing on demographics, and clearly he said it all when talking about the diversity of this borough. I think that that is such an asset. Queens, just about half of the population is foreign-born. Queens also has one of the largest African-American middle classes in the Northeast. Those are assets, things to build on, and Queens has already done a lot, but I think there's more that could be done. Balanced economy. This is something that I think not everybody focuses on, but a lot of New York in the last 10 years has been trying to figure out, how do we get less dependent on Wall Street? How do we identify new areas of job growth? When a region, when a city is overly dependent on one or two areas, and it doesn't have to be finance, there could be danger when downturns occur, when things change, and you're left kind of holding the bag. But Queens is one of the unique places in New York City where it has a fairly balanced economy. So the first statistic that I have here is healthcare, social assistance, and retail trade. Now, these are kind of the sectors that you often find in the boroughs outside of Manhattan that are particularly strong. But I think it's telling and important for Queens that Queens, of the four boroughs outside of Manhattan, has by far the lowest share of their jobs in these sectors. So Staten Island and the Bronx pretty much have half of all their jobs in these two areas of the economy. Brooklyn, almost 50%, and Queens is only about a third. More on the balanced economy. 5 different sectors in Queens account for at least 8% of the borough's total jobs. So you've got healthcare and social assistance, about 22% of the private sector jobs in Queens, transportation and warehousing, 12%, retail, 12%, construction, 8.5%, and accommodation and food service, 8.1%. Queens also has a healthy economy. In the last decade, Queens has done fairly well economically speaking. So in the last decade, Queens added roughly twice as many jobs as Manhattan. You see here, it added 3 times the number of jobs as the nation overall. And if you look at the bottom and middle there, you see in the last 30 years, Queens' share of all the private sector jobs in New York City has gone from 13.8 to 15.1. So in many ways, even as well as Manhattan has done in a lot of this period, Queens has really become more of a job center than it was before. These are all things really to build on. Of course, within the economy, Queens is incredibly entrepreneurial. I mentioned our work that we've done before about the real powerful impact of immigrant entrepreneurs in this borough and in the city, but we found that of the 28 New York City neighborhoods, and according to the census, there's 55 census-defined neighborhoods in New York City. Obviously, as the earlier speaker said, there's 74 neighborhoods just in Queens, but if you go by just what a kind of census-defined neighborhood is, which is obviously fairly big, about a third of them with the highest rates of self-employment, which we're kind of taking as an indicator, as a measure of business formation, about a third of them are in Queens. Flushing boasts the zip code with the second highest number of establishments per capita. So there's a lot of business formation. Anybody walking around places like Flushing, Richmond Hill, Jackson Heights, Astoria, and so many other places, Elmhurst, the only thing that's holding back new entrepreneurs is that there's just not enough space. So much entrepreneurship going on in those and other neighborhoods. Also, we did a look at how many new business and corporations there were in Queens 20 years ago versus today. And these are just like filing papers with the State Department of State. When you open a business, you have to incorporate and file papers. And look at this incredible jump over a 20-year period. In 1991, there were about 7,100 new businesses formed in Queens, and 20 years later, in 2011, 16,100. Now that's just those individual years, just 16,000 businesses formed in the year 2011 by itself. And I can tell you that it's pretty steady. 2010, 2009, also right about at that number each year, about 16,000 new businesses being formed here. Another asset, blue-collar jobs. One of the things that we hear about, one of the things that we write about New York City's economy that's a real challenge for New York is that we're really struggling to create middle-income jobs. There's a lot of people in New York that don't have the education levels to access a lot of the jobs out there today that require 4-year degrees or even 2-year degrees. We're losing manufacturing jobs in the city, but Queens has, better than any other borough, managed to retain blue-collar jobs. And if you see here, Queens has 149,000 PDR jobs. This is a new term that economists are using to describe production, distribution, and repair jobs. So more than any other borough. Also, I think it's notable, and perhaps in part because of this, over the last 5 years, New York has seen a pretty significant increase in the number of people working in low-wage jobs, which we define, or we just use the federal definition. For New York, it's less than $27,000 a year in earnings. So that number has risen pretty significantly citywide, but Queens was the only borough during this 5 period not to see an increase in the number of people working in low-wage jobs. So those are some assets to build on, and I'm sure that I've missed a bunch, and we have others that we'll be including in the report, but there's also a lot of things happening. It's not just assets to build on, but there's actually a lot of momentum happening in this borough. You see it all over. Long Island City, I've been quoted in articles about Long Island City commercial development for 10 or 12 years, and it seemed like every couple of years people were talking about when is Long Island City arriving, and there were a lot of fits and starts. MetLife came 10 years ago or so to Long Island City, then it left back to Manhattan. There's a lot of things that have happened, but right now for Long Island City, there's a real sweet spot. There's a real critical mass of residential development that's happening right now. Every time you go by there's another building going up. There's also new commercial development that's occurred there. The film industry with Silvercup Studios, Kaufman Astoria, they've been expanding. There's obviously the art scene is happening, and so much happening in Long Island City, and I think this is a real great emblem for Queens' arrival and growth. Downtown Flushing, there's so much happening there. I think it's the Main Street and Roosevelt intersection is like the second or third busiest intersection in all of New York City. I think it's the second or third busiest train station in all of New York City, despite the fact that there's only one subway line that goes through there. It's actually got about a third of the ridership or the people going through there as Times Square, and Times Square has, a dozen or so different lines going through there. So, there's so much happening in Flushing. Investment is occurring at JFK, to a lesser extent at LaGuardia, but at a time when we're in this global world, at a time when more and more tourists from around the world are coming to New York City. It's over 50 million every year. Having the airports here in Queens is a big deal, and Queens benefits greatly from that. You see hotel development all over the place. Long Island City, Dutch Kills in particular, but in a lot of other parts of the borough. Flushing, Jamaica is about to get a couple of new hotels near the Long Island Railroad Station. It's pretty remarkable what's occurred in the last 5 or 10 years with hotel development. The idea is hopefully this will benefit local entertainment, restaurant, other venues, cultural institutions in the borough. But one way or the other, people are going to be spending their money in Queens more than before. Brooklyn migration, this is something there's not a lot of data about, but we are seeing a lot more people moving directly from Brooklyn to Queens. So, I don't know, at some point in the last 20 years, you started to see a lot of people that instead of living in Manhattan, they would go straight to Brooklyn when they came to New York. A lot of those young professionals, have basically said, we can't afford Brooklyn anymore, and they're moving straight to Queens. They're moving to places like Jackson Heights, to Sunnyside, to Astoria, and they're choosing to raise families here in Queens, and there's something there that's really special. We've actually crunched some numbers on the demographic shift between the boroughs, and it's almost 50,000 people that have moved from Brooklyn to Queens in the last 5 or 6 years. Tech, one of the really amazing things that's happened in New York City's economy in recent years is this incredible startup tech explosion. New York really has become the #2 technology hub in the nation behind Silicon Valley. And, we're starting to see a little bit of that in Western Queens, in places like Long Island City. And there's a lot of potential. There's some great community gathering that's happening there. There's an organization called Coalition for Queens. They've been organizing tech meetups in Long Island City, and they've got a lot of people that are a part of that. So there's something special that may be happening. Of course, Queens is not without its challenges, and so as we look on this study about the future of Queens, I think that policymakers really need to look at what are those obstacles, what needs to be addressed. So I think one of the big ones is, if quality of life is such a strength for the borough, I think the number one thing is whatever happens as Queens grows, as it changes in the years ahead, we've got to really make sure that we don't do anything to really disrupt the great quality of life in this borough. One of those things that I think is a potential threat to quality of life is overcrowded schools. Now, we've actually gotten data looking at they have information on overcrowded schools by borough and by district, and Queens has by far the largest percentage of overcrowded schools of any borough in New York City. So people come here because the schools are good, they want to raise their families here, but overcrowding schools is a real threat. This is something that we've got to address. Poor transit connectivity, long commuting times. I think anybody that actually lives in Queens or works in Queens is well familiar with this, but Queens is really one of the parts of New York that I think really has poor transit connectivity. So many neighborhoods in Queens have a two-seat ride. They have to take two forms of transportation to get to work. So many neighborhoods are not connected to subways. Many commuters in the borough ride a bus, but you all know how that can be very iffy and problematic at times. One quick bit of information about the transit issues is the number of commuters who cross the Brooklyn-Queens border every day has increased by 15%, or nearly 20,000 people over the last couple of decades. So, one of the really interesting trends that we're seeing in commuting patterns is that people are no longer only going into Manhattan for jobs. They're staying within their own borough, or they're going from one outer borough to another outer borough. And we're seeing that Brooklyn-Queens connection be more and more important. But if anybody here has family or friends that live in Brooklyn, it is so difficult to get from one to the other. Clearly you can drive, but that can be a drag too. But there needs to be better public transportation between the boroughs. Queens identity. This is something that's come up, and this goes without saying, but anybody who's spent any time in Queens knows that, when you live in Brooklyn, you put on your mailing address, Brooklyn, New York. In Queens, you write Forest Hills or Ridgewood or Maspeth or Flushing. And, a lot of the folks that we've talked to, without asking them, without prompting, have really mentioned this as a real problem, that people don't feel like that there's a kind of a common thread, that they're part of a bigger borough. In Brooklyn, you have, Marty Markowitz, the borough president, has put up signs when you're going into Brooklyn. It says, welcome to Brooklyn. When you leave, it says, forget about it, And, he's been this cheerleader, but it was easier to be a cheerleader, I think, for Brooklyn because there was this brand, this identity about Brooklyn that Queens doesn't have. And so that's a challenging thing to wrestle with, and how would you really address that? But it's one thing that a lot of people have brought up with us. Other challenges. I think this is one that also is tough to get a handle on, but the nonprofit infrastructure. A lot of neighborhoods that have thrived, a lot of neighborhoods that have come back, that have improved, owe a lot to leadership from nonprofit organizations in their communities. And I think that Queens has a number of phenomenal organizations, but I think for any place that has so many newcomers, there's a lot of fairly nascent organizations here. There's a lot of organizations that haven't yet kind of figured out how to scale themselves up and do a lot of things extremely well. They have credibility within their own communities, but they struggle sometimes to, let's say, access major city contracts, to do some of the things that they need to be doing to help their communities. And so I think there's something here about really helping more of the borough's nonprofits scale up, develop more capacity that's got to be addressed. So as a quick aside about that, business improvement districts. This is not necessarily what I'm talking about when I mention nonprofits, but I took a look recently at the number of business improvement districts in Brooklyn and Queens. And Queens actually has about half of the business districts that Brooklyn does. Even though Brooklyn and Queens have roughly the same number of people and have roughly the same number of businesses, and there's certainly a lot of thriving business districts in Queens. But this is the kind of thing that we've seen in a bunch of different areas in Queens where people haven't formed these kind of organizations, whether it's business improvement districts or other things that might play a role in helping the neighborhood grow or prosper. And, another one is community development financial institutions. There's actually a lot fewer federally certified CDFIs here in Queens than there are in Brooklyn as well. And so, it's just something that we think we need to pay attention to. Hospitals. I don't know what the problem is with hospitals here, except that Queens has had a bunch of hospitals close in recent years, and it's just a little shocking when I look at the numbers of employment of people working at hospitals and find out that there are actually fewer people working at hospitals in Queens than in the Bronx. The Bronx has a lot fewer people overall living in the Bronx, but Queens has considerably fewer people working at hospitals. And so, I bring this up only because as Queens looks to grow its economy, healthcare has become, important. Clearly, this part of healthcare has not been as much of a driver for Queens' economy as it is for other places. And while I mentioned it earlier as a strength, I do think that there may be an opportunity here to develop more healthcare-related jobs in the borough. Parks, open space. This again goes back to the quality of life issues that I mentioned earlier. Quality of life, parks and places where people can walk and play, and this is important to any community. I think we've seen nationally and in cities across the nation how important open space is to just kind of economic vitality. But Queens is really lacking in this area. I think that Flushing Meadows, Corona Park could be a lot better. There are significant parts of that park that are flooded pretty much year-round. There has not been the kind of investment in that park that should be occurring. We've got to address that. Overall, Queens actually has less share, a smaller share of its overall land that's used as an open space today than any other borough. So this is something that I think that Queens could really benefit from more open space or better investments in the open space that it does have. The aging of the population. This is something that every borough has got to reckon with. New York's population is aging rapidly, but Queens is one of the older boroughs out there. You see it when you walk around a lot of neighborhoods of Queens. Certainly, I see it in Forest Hills a lot, and I think that just is one of those things that policymakers are going to have to plan for. One thing that's unique to Queens is that the immigrant population is getting a lot older, and there are some unique issues and opportunities there. Obviously, rebuilding the Rockaway is a major challenge, something that in the aftermath of Sandy, the policymakers have got to continue to focus on. That last word here is reactive, and I put that in here as a challenge because I think that it's my sense that policymakers, business leaders, civic leaders in Queens have been fairly reactive. There have been developments that are occurring here. MLS wants to build a soccer stadium. People kind of mull it over and say yes or no. Someone wants to put a racino at Aqueduct Racetrack, and that happens or it doesn't happen. There's other developments that are coming. I haven't seen the kind of really kind of forward-looking, we should be doing this, this, and this. And I think that, Queens has got to be much more aspirational and put forth much more of an agenda on what we do want for this borough. Obviously, that's what our report is trying to do, but I think that the kind of policymakers in the civic community in this borough really need to be much more ambitious, I think. So opportunities. This is something that we're working on right now, restoring New York City's middle-class dream. If you paid any attention during the mayoral campaign this year, clearly one of the big challenges is kind of, what's happening to the middle class? What's happening to those that are aspiring to be middle class in New York? There's, economic mobility has become, really challenging in this city. The number of working poor is growing. And I think that policymakers citywide are going to be looking to tackle this. And I think that some of those solutions should be right here in Queens. This is a borough that's long been this aspirational borough, and I think that Queens really needs to figure out how is it at the center of efforts to kind of rebuild or restore that kind of middle-class dream for New York. I think part of that may be housing, workforce housing. I mentioned earlier that Brooklyn has become so expensive. There's not really any affordable place left in Manhattan to live, and Queens has certainly gotten more expensive as well. But there are opportunities here. I think this could be a place where more people go to for those affordable opportunities. I think that we're going to have to develop new housing to enable this to happen. I think it's also a challenge, though, because surprisingly, when we've looked at the numbers, Queens has actually seen less, kind of a smaller jump in new housing development than I think just about any other borough in New York City. And so despite all that's happening in Long Island City, there's not a huge amount of new housing that's been occurring or that's being built in Queens. And I think that there's reasons for that. There's some great low-scale neighborhoods, mainly of single-family homes in New York. That's an asset for this borough. But I think that the borough needs to figure out a way to, preserve and strengthen some of those neighborhoods while at the same time allowing for some of the new housing that could bring in strivers, middle class, other New Yorkers that want to be here. And right now, there's just not enough new housing development taking place. Authentic New York. I see this as an opportunity because we're also at this time when for the last 5 or 10 years, you hear a lot about, all of these national chains coming in. New York has gotten so it's the same as Cleveland or Pittsburgh. What's unique about New York anymore? And, Queens is one of those places where it is unique, it is authentic, and go to any of these great neighborhoods in the borough, and you really get a unique and interesting experience. And I think that's something to really build on, and I think that we should. The untapped waterfront. So what I'm saying here is that clearly Long Island City is happening right now, but there is more waterfront in Queens. There is this whole kind of waterfront from Long Island City to the Triborough Bridge that I think is an area of opportunity. There's other parts of waterfront that may be an opportunity for Queens. Transit investments, I mentioned those before. What if there was major transit connecting the waterfronts of Brooklyn and Queens? What if you had a light rail, for instance, going from the Triborough Bridge all the way to Red Hook, connecting neighborhoods from Astoria and Long Island City to Greenpoint, Williamsburg, and Red Hook, and going through the Navy Yard and Dumbo? That would be interesting. Connecting to Cornell Technion. Cornell and Technion are investing, huge amounts of money in this new technology and applied sciences campus on Roosevelt Island, just a stone's throw from Long Island City. There's clearly an opportunity to connect that with Long Island City and Queens. The question is, how do we do that? I think that I would say that it's got to be more than just Long Island City. It may be that we think about places on the F train that go to Roosevelt Island but that are in Queens that may become major destinations for faculty or some of the engineers that work on Roosevelt Island. Maybe they become, they end up wanting to live in places like Jackson Heights and Forest Hills and other places along the F line. Tourism. Obviously, this is already happening. We've got hotels, but I think also as tourism in the city becomes more international in scope, as we get more tourists coming from China and other places of Asia and South America, it may be that given the nature of the population here, tourism becomes much more of a selling point in Queens. Downtown Jamaica, this is one that we so far see as an opportunity and a challenge. This is a neighborhood that just went through the city's largest single rezoning about 5 years ago, but right now, since that time, nothing's really happened with the rezoning. And there's a real opportunity. There's been some great investments in downtown Jamaica, but more is needed, and I think this could be a time over the next 10 years to see downtown Jamaica start to prosper more. Queens Boulevard, I think you saw on the slide earlier the idea of Boulevard of Death. I guess, maybe this is a naive idea, but, you go to great cities across the world and there are these sparkling boulevards. And, could we do something to make the Boulevard of Queens worthy of its name? And, it may be a long way off, but what if there was more mixed-use development? What if we kind of did something with interesting design to make it more safe and less wide? Those may sound like kind of really ambitious ideas, but I'd love to see something done with Queens Boulevard. Finally, Sunnyside Yards. A lot of people never thought there'd be something done with the Hudson Yards in Manhattan. A lot of people never thought there'd be movement at Willets Point. And really one of the only places left to think about for large-scale development in the city is Sunnyside Yards, the idea of decking over Sunnyside Yards. There are actually some really interesting ideas to make Sunnyside Yards maybe a intermodal transportation hub. There are ideas to maybe bring the Javits Center to Sunnyside Yards. There are ideas that could be a place for a significant amount of housing. Anyway, these are just a few of the ideas we have so far, and I hope I haven't gone on too long and bored you a little bit, but we're thinking a lot about Queens, and we'd really love to have any other ideas that you all have. Thanks for having me.